Hi, welcome back. This is slides 4.2, Grid Systems and Templates. So we're going to discuss CSS resets and normalize scripts. We're also going to talk about CSS grid systems, templates, and HTML5 frameworks. First, let's talk about a CSS reset. So oftentimes, when you're building your own websites, you're going to want to go out and download a CSS reset. We've actually been using one that I've given you, or rather a version of a reset called Normalize, which we'll discuss a little bit more about in a moment. But essentially, a CSS reset, what it does is it's going to remove all of the default browser style. So you may have noticed before we learned CSS in the first module, you guys were using just HTML to write content. For some reason, all of that content already had an inherent style. And that's because each browser was determining what the style of that text should be, how large it should be, what color it was, and what font face it was using. Now, there's subtle differences from browser to browser, and a CSS reset is a way that we can get consistent styles across all of the browsers by first removing all of the browser style, and then you can go back in and add your own CSS style. So whenever we use a reset, what we're going to do is we're going to first link to the CSS reset file, and then we're going to link to our own custom style sheet in order to add style back into our website. These are some examples of some popular CSS resets. So if you go to a search engine online and you search for any of these titles, then you'll be able to find the code that you can go ahead and download and use for your CSS reset. So Myers is a common reset. It's called Myers Reset. Another one that people use is called Toucan. There's also one called YUI. And there's another one I'm going to show you that some people call the Poor Man's Reset, which you can just quickly write out yourself to reset the styles in your browser. This is an example of the Poor Man's Reset, which you can just write out yourself at the top of your style sheet if you choose. So this would be an alternative to, instead of downloading these other resets like Myers, Toucan, and YUI, you could write your own pretty quickly by using this code here. What this does is it basically selects everything in the HTML page, and then it removes all of the padding and all of the margin off every single element. So there's no spaces between any of the elements. And one of the reasons why you do this is, for example, in Firefox, the spacing between paragraphs might be slightly different than the spacing in Safari or something like that. So the reset solution is to remove all of the style, in this case all of the spacing, and then you can go back in your own style sheet, in your own custom style sheet, and you can add, a line of code that says, well, I want all paragraphs to have 10 pixels of margin underneath them or something like that. We also set all the font sizes here in HTML embody to the regular default 100%, and this actually takes the all of the images that have links surrounding them and removes a border. Sometimes when you add a link to an image, it will get a little blue box around it, and when it's a visited link, it'll get like a purple border around it, and this will prevent that by removing the border from all of the images that are surrounded by the A tags there. So this is like a very simple small reset. These other resets, Myers, Toucan, and YUI, will actually be many, many more lines of code. Some of these are even hundreds of lines of code. So they're a little more sophisticated than Poor Man's. So I would actually recommend, most likely it's best to just go ahead and download one of these. Instead of using a traditional reset for our site project, the ZHW shoe site that we've been building, what we used was a normalize.css file. And you can see here's the link where you can go and grab the code for the normalize.css file. So normalize is similar to a reset, except that it goes back in and adds some style to get you started. So like whereas when you use some of these other resets like the Myers, Toucan, YUI, what happens is all headings, for example, appear to be the same size. So The normalized script, it removes style, but then it goes back in and adds style so that it will appear the same in all the different browsers. Next, let's talk about CSS grid systems. So we sort of built our own grid system in our style.css page by creating those classes of column 1 left, column 1 middle, column 1 right, and we had been floating them in different directions and setting various widths to them. So we created classes called col1 or col1 for things that were only going to span one column in our 3-column setup. And we also created another class called col2, col2, to represent elements that had a wider width that spanned 2 columns in our 3-column structure. And we even had one called col3 that spanned all the way across the wrapper, all 3 of the columns. So we kind of built our own simplified grid system. It turns out you can actually go online and download pre-built CSS code that already has a lot of that positioning code written. And these are called CSS grid systems. This is actually a diagram from a popular one called the 960 grid system. And this is a diagram to show you how it works. So this grid system has a lot more possibilities than the one we created, because you remember the grid system we created was only at most a 3-column grid system. And this one, which is actually from 960 grid system, this one has a total of 12-column possibilities. These are some examples of some popular CSS grid systems. So again, if you go to your search engine and you type in any of these titles, it will come up with a site where you can go ahead and download these free open source CSS files that you can use to get you started in building your website project. So there's 960, Blueprint is another popular grid system, Send CSS, Semantic Grid, and there's also an entire framework called Bootstrap, which has its own grid system included. This is actually showing kind of how your content can fit over top of that grid. So taking that last grid we were looking at, and if we kind of superimpose pink columns over top of it, then you can see that, for example, the advertisement area here is spanning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And you can see that the sidebar over here is only spanning 2 columns. So depending on the class name you use for the specific grid system, it's going to make your elements a different width and also give them different float commands so that they can position next to each other. Now, whatever grid system you do choose to download, you're going to want to make sure to read the documentation for that particular grid system, because they all have different class names and they all expect you to use them slightly differently. Let's also talk about HTML5 frameworks. So HTML5 Boilerplate is an example of a template library that you can download. Essentially, it gets you started. It already has most of the document structure created. It comes with HTML files, CSS files, and even some JavaScript files that already have fixes in place to make your website work on all the different browsers. So HTML5 Boilerplate gives support for HTML5 elements on even your oldest browsers and on all devices. And there's also a mobile version of this framework known as HTML5 Boilerplate Mobile. So these are the links that you can go ahead and check that out. So you could download this code and you can throw it into Sublime Text, and you really only have to go in and start adding your content. All of the document structure is already set up, and it's already linking to CSS and JavaScript files that you can use. Twitter Bootstrap is another popular framework, and Twitter Bootstrap also includes, aside from HTML and CSS, it also includes a lot of jQuery plugins. So you can create things like image galleries, sliding menus, and things like that without having to go out and write the custom JavaScript yourself, and just being able to load the plugins that they provide you. I want to encourage you guys to keep learning and keep writing code every day.